The chamber smelled of recycled coolant and dry institutional air, the same as every evaluation suite on Meridian Station, and Assessor Thrix Kell of the Galactic Combat Evaluation Board had sat in exactly this kind of room enough times to stop noticing the smell 6 cycles ago. What he noticed instead, on the morning of what he expected to be a routine dismissal processing, was the thickness of the file. Not the physical data pad, which was standardized and no heavier at 1,000 entries than at 1, but the secondary documentation it had flagged. The attached records, the cross-referenced incidents, the 3 separate institutional inquiries that had each been opened and then quietly closed. 3 inquiries. The board processed failed candidates every standard month. None of them accumulated 3 inquiries. He set the data pad down and looked at the chair across the review table. It was empty. The human was not yet here, and for a moment the emptiness of it struck him as worth noting. The chair was regulation Solvathi dimensions, calibrated for a being of approximately his own mass and limb configuration, approximately 2 meters in seated height, with the desk surface at mid-torso. He had received a physical notation in the file before the candidate's arrival. She was approximately 1.65 meters standing. The chair would swallow her. He found himself wondering whether she would ask for an adjustment. He looked back at the file. The failure notation was clear. The Korath Protocol assessment, administered on the 17th day of the 3rd evaluation cycle, had returned a result of mission parameters incomplete, which was the board's formal language for a candidate who had exited the scenario before objectives were secured. That was the failure. It sat there in plain institutional text, stamped with the sub-assessor's certification and the automated rubric score, 41 out of 100, below threshold. The standard consequence was dismissal from the combat integration track and reassignment to support or liaison functions. That was what today was for. He reviewed the preamble section of the file as a matter of habit. Human Systems Alliance, Officer Track, Lieutenant, Junior Grade. 3 years of service, 2 of them in active deployment rotation in the outer reach sectors where the Scraith incursions had been concentrated and where, the Solvathi had noted with some relief, human soldiers had proven surprisingly effective. Mara Voss. He ran the name through his translator's phonetic parser because human names had a tendency to contain silent letters that embarrassed him when he mispronounced them in formal proceedings. Mara Voss. Straightforward. He was still looking at the file when the door opened. She walked in without hurrying. She was, as the file had indicated, compact. She wore the standard issue gray combat utility uniform of a Human Systems Alliance officer, pressed and unremarkable. Her hair was dark and pulled back. Her eyes, when she settled them on him from across the room, were light-colored and still, and through his compound visual array, which rendered warm-blooded beings in the deep thermal spectrum as luminous beneath their surface layers, she read as a kind of concentrated warmth, moving with deliberate economy. She noted the chair, assessed it in one glance, and sat forward in it with her forearms on the table so that her boots reached the floor without strain. She did not ask for an adjustment. She looked at him and waited. "Lieutenant Voss," he said, "thank you for attending." "Of course," she said. Her translator rendered this in standard without inflection. He opened the data pad and began the procedural preamble, because procedure was the shape of institutional reality, and he was a careful assessor who did not skip steps. He cited the assessment cycle number, the date of administration, the supervising subassessor certification, the scenario designation. She listened without moving. He cited the outcome notation and the rubric score. She listened to that as well, with no visible change in her expression, which he had catalogued in his first 30 seconds of observing her as neutral in the clinical sense rather than the performed sense. There was a difference in his experience. The performed neutral carried a quality of effort, a subtle tension in the facial musculature of beings trying to appear unaffected. Her neutral carried no such tension. It was simply the way her face was arranged when she was not using it to convey something specific. He reached the end of the preamble and looked up. Before I process the formal outcome, he said, board practice permits a candidate to make a brief statement for the record. This is voluntary, not required. I know, she said. He waited. She did not continue. He made a note on the secondary pad. The assessment in question, he said carefully, was the Korath protocol scenario. You are familiar with the parameters? Yes. The scenario designates a command structure collapse in a contested environment. The candidate is tasked with securing the primary objective with whatever forces and resources are available. The evaluation criterion is objective completion. She tilted her head a fraction. A human gesture he could not categorize as agreement or disagreement, but which in the thermal spectrum registered as a slight sharpening of focus, the quality of attention that in prey animals preceded recognition of something relevant and in predatory animals preceded a decision. Is that what the criterion is? She said. It was not phrased as a question. He looked at his data pad. The rubric scores objective completion on a binary, completed or incomplete. The notation on your assessment record is incomplete. The objective was secured, she said. He stopped. He looked up from the data pad. The notation states that mission parameters were not completed. I know what the notation states. I'm telling you the objective was secured. All primary points were held at scenario termination. No assets lost. The scenario completed within the standard window. Thrix-Kell's primary mandibles contracted slightly, an involuntary tell he was aware of and generally managed better than this. He looked at the file again. The rubric notation was, as he had said, mission parameters incomplete. There was a sub-comment from the administering assessor, and he had not read it closely because sub-comments on failure notations were typically administrative observations about candidate conduct. He read it now. It said, candidate deviated from established scenario parameters at minute 11. Deviation resulted in non-standard resolution. Reviewing assessor flagged for rubric clarification. His mandibles contracted again. You deviated from the established parameters, he said. Yes. Can you describe the deviation? She considered this, not in the way beings consider difficult questions, but in the way beings consider how much of a simple answer will actually be required. The scenario gives you a fixed set of assets, she said. A standard fire team configuration, standard equipment load, established defensive positions along 3 primary hold points, and it gives you an enemy force positioned to overrun those hold points in approximately 13 minutes, which is the standard scenario runtime. The objective is to hold the positions until the notional extraction window opens at minute 14. The rubric scores on whether positions are held at extraction. He nodded, following. At minute 11, she said. I pulled my people back. He waited. All of them, she said. Pulled them from the positions, ran them through the service corridor behind the secondary hold point, came around behind the enemy force's left flank, and hit them from a direction. The scenario parameters don't include as an axis of attack because the scenario parameters assume the candidate will stay in the established positions until they're overrun. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the same focused stillness, and he had the peculiar sensation of a being who has asked a simple question and received an answer that has quietly rearranged everything he thought the question was about. The enemy force was oriented to attack, she said. They were not oriented to defend. We had the position secure in 4 minutes. The extraction window was still open. 0 casualties. Objective complete. The deviation from parameters, he said slowly, resulted in the rubric flagging your run as non-standard. Yes. Because the rubric doesn't account for a resolution pathway that wasn't designed into the scenario. Correct. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside in the corridor, he could hear the low, cycling hum of Meridian Station's atmospheric processors, steady and indifferent. He looked at the file. He looked at the 3 institutional inquiries that had been opened and closed. He understood now why they had been opened. He was not yet sure why they had been closed, and he intended to find out. Lieutenant Voss, he said carefully, the board will need to schedule an expanded review before a final determination is made on your assessment outcome. She nodded. Once. I'll be in the station, Jim, she said, when you're ready. She stood, and he noticed she did this without using the chair arms, simply unfolded upward from the seat in one motion, the way compact organisms move when their center of gravity is low and their balance is habitual rather than considered. She crossed to the door, paused with her hand on the frame, and looked back at him. You'll want to pull the full run data before the review, she said. Not the rubric output, the full sensor log. The assessor who flagged it pulled the wrong records. Then she left, and the door sealed behind her, and Thrixkel sat alone in the empty chamber for a moment and then pulled up the full sensor log and began to read. It took him 4 hours to understand what he was looking at. Another 2 to pull the comparative data he needed, cross-referencing deployment records that the board did not typically track because the board's mandate ended at assessment, and the downstream field outcomes were another department's concern. By the time he had assembled the complete picture, the station's ambient lighting had cycled into the dimmer evening register and the corridor outside was quiet. The Korath protocol had been in the board's assessment battery for 40 years, standard. In that time, it had been administered 847 times across 12 species cleared for combat integration assessment. Of those 847 administrations, 72 candidates had achieved a passing score, meaning a rubric-confirmed objective completion under parameters. 72 out of 847. Thrixkel had always considered this a testament to the rigor of the assessment. He had never had occasion to look at what the 72 had done afterward. He looked now because the institutional inquiries had each independently looked at a subset of those records, and each inquiry had found the same pattern, and each inquiry had closed without formal finding. He had found, in reviewing the first inquiry's attached notes, a line that read, "Results inconclusive." Further investigation would require expanded dataset not presently available to this assessor. He had found the same line, nearly verbatim, in the second inquiry's notes. In the third, it was phrased differently. It read, "Results noted." Matter referred to senior review. He had found no record of the senior review. Of the 72 candidates who had passed the Korath protocol with standard rubric-compliant completions, 68 had records of post-assessment combat deployments. Of those 68, 68 had died in the field. Not eventually, as any soldier might in a sustained conflict, within 6 months of their Korath passing score. Every single one. He set the data pad down. He sat in the dimming chamber for a long time. Then he accessed the assessment database and searched for any non-standard resolution run in the Korath protocol's 40-year history. Any run where the rubric had flagged a deviation, as it had flagged Maravas's run. He found 4 total. 3 had been processed as failures, and the candidates reassigned to non-combat functions. They were all, according to current records, alive and serving, in the capacities they had been redirected toward. The 4th was a Raxian candidate whose deviation had been flagged 19 months ago, ruled a disqualifying protocol breach for reasons that, reading the notation carefully, appeared to have more to do with the administering assessor's unfamiliarity with Raxian tactical doctrine than with any actual breach. The Raxian candidate was listed as currently serving in a liaison capacity, also alive. He pulled Maravas's full sensor log and watched the playback a second time, and then a third. She had held her fire team in position through the opening phase, calm and precise, responding to each developing pressure point with standard doctrine. Nothing unusual, nothing the rubric would flag. He watched the counter tick toward minute 11. Then he watched her do something that the sensor log rendered in clean mechanical notation, but that, watching it, felt less like a tactical decision and more like the recognition of an obvious truth that the scenario had not anticipated anyone actually noticing. She pulled them back. Unhurried, coordinated, no wasted movement, as if the retreat was not a deviation, but the actual plan, and had always been the plan from the moment she walked in. He watched her route them through the service corridor behind the secondary hold point, a corridor that was in the scenario map as infrastructure, not as a tactical element, because the scenario's designers had put it there for environmental completeness and had not expected anyone to use it as an axis. He watched her establish the attack angle. He watched the enemy force's response time when contact came from the unexpected direction. Slower, disoriented, the forward momentum that had been their tactical advantage, now a liability, because they were moving toward positions that no longer contained anyone, and the threat had come from behind. The scenario reached its resolution clock. All positions secure. All assets present. Objective complete. The sensor logs had her confirm this in plain text. The rubric had not seen it that way, because the rubric had not been written to account for a candidate who solved the problem from outside the problem's own geometry. Thrixkel reached for his communications panel and sent an urgent convening request to the full board review chamber for 0800 the following morning. Then, he sent a second message to the Human Systems Alliance office on Meridian Station. Flagged routine, but not routine, requesting the attendance of the senior Alliance officer for a board consultation. Then he sat very still in the dimming room and thought about the fact that the board had been running a protocol for 40 years that selected, with remarkable consistency, for the candidates most likely to die in the field. He thought about this for a long time. He did not reach a comfortable conclusion because there was none. He sent both messages. Then he stood and walked to the view panel beside his desk, the one that looked out not onto the docking array but onto the station's inner transit corridor, the long pedestrian throughway where every species on Meridian moved between quarters and duty posts and the various institutional functions that kept a station like this running. He watched it for a moment. The long, blue-gray reach of it, the overhead panels cycling through their evening dimmer, beings of 4 or 5 species moving in both directions with the practiced indifference of shared habitation. A pair of Kaldrathi in administrative gray, a Solvathi technician with a tool bag, moving at the brisk pace of someone overdue somewhere. 2 humans near the mid-corridor junction, one of them in Alliance Utilities, who stopped and said something to the other with a brief economy of gesture before they split apart in opposite directions. He watched them go and thought about the sensor log and about 68 names, and then he went back to the data pad and started drafting the convening notice. The board chamber was a larger room than the review suite, configured with a curved table for the 3-member evaluation panel and a single seat facing them from below, positioned deliberately on a tiered floor plan so that candidates looked up at the panel when they sat. The design was intentional, specified in the board's architectural commission as conducive to candid assessment, and Thrixkel had sat on the high side of it for 12 cycles and had never previously thought very hard about what it implied to always look down at the person being evaluated. He sat at the panel's center position. To his left, Subassessor Vren of the Kaldrathi species, whose ochre gold carapace caught the chamber lighting in a way that suggested he had taken some care with his appearance, which Thrixkel noted as a sign that Vren had read the preliminary briefing and understood the stakes. To his right, Senior Assessor Pelith of the Raxian species, secondary appendages folded with the studied stillness of a long-serving institutional figure, face arranged in the particular careful neutrality that long service teaches. Mara Voss sat in the lower seat and looked up at them with light-colored eyes and no particular expression. She did not appear to find the architecture of the arrangement meaningful, which was itself a kind of statement. Colonel Denise Hargrove of the Human Systems Alliance occupied the observer's chair along the chamber wall. She was a tall woman with silver at her temples and a datapad she had not looked at since she sat down, which suggested she had read everything there was to read before she arrived and considered none of it surprising. Thrixkel walked the board through the comparative data. He took his time because the data deserved time, and because he had found across 12 cycles of board work that institutional conclusions landed better when they were walked to, carefully, rather than announced. Subassessor Vren asked him to repeat the field outcome statistic twice. 68 passing candidates with tracked deployments. 68 field deaths within 6 months of their Korath passing score. Both times Vren asked, his carapace shifted toward the duller register that Kaldrathi dermis adopted under cognitive stress, and both times it did not fully recover before the next item of data arrived. Senior Assessor Pelith's secondary appendages unfolded and refolded in a slow, repetitive motion that Thrixkel recognized as the Raxian equivalent of a being who is constructing several competing frameworks simultaneously and finding none of them satisfactory. Thrixkel watched them both. Then he looked at the human. "Lieutenant Voss," he said, "you stated yesterday that the objective was secured. The full sensor log confirms this. Can you explain, in your own words, what your assessment of the scenario parameters was at the point you made the decision to deviate?" She considered this for a moment in the way she had considered all his questions, not hesitating, simply allocating the correct amount of thought to the correct amount of answer. The parameters were designed to put you in a position where holding the line would cost everything, she said. The force ratio, the angles, the timeline. They're calibrated so that a static defense runs out of options by minute 13. Every asset depleted. The objective technically held for about 40 seconds before the follow-on wave overruns the position. The rubric scores the moment of hold, not the consequence. Pelith's secondary appendages stilled completely. "You understood this at minute 11, he said. "Earlier than that," she said. "Minute 11 was when I had confirmed the angles on the corridor approach. Before that, I was maintaining position and watching their movement cadence." "You determined," Pelith said carefully, as if he were testing the weight of each word before he set it down. that the scenario as designed was intended to evaluate willingness to spend all available assets in a static defense until nothing remained. I determined that the scenario as designed would kill everyone in it if you ran it the way it was written, she said. That's not a test. That's a problem with an exit that someone forgot to close. The chamber was quiet. Colonel Hargrove had not moved from the observer's chair, but she had set down the data pad she hadn't been looking at anyway, and her expression was the expression of a person watching a long-expected thing arrive and finding in its arrival something past the ordinary relief of being right. "With respect, Lieutenant," Vren said, and his translator rendered his species' formal address register as a particular elevated flatness that Thrix-Kell had learned across years of shared sessions to read as institutional recalibration in progress. The Korath Protocol has been a validated assessment tool for 4 decades. The developers calibrated it to evaluate crisis decision-making under maximum pressure. Its use has been certified at the senior board level through 3 successive review cycles. "I don't doubt any of that," Mara said. She said it without heat, without the particular emphasis that would have made it a challenge. She said it as one states a fact that does not conflict with the next fact, merely coexists with it. What were the field outcomes of candidates who passed it in the first decade before any review? The board's silence had a different quality this time. Thrix-Kell watched Vren's carapace, which was moving through color registers in a way that suggested several things being simultaneously reconsidered. He watched Polith's secondary appendages, which had not resumed their motion. He thought about the 3 institutional inquiries that had found the pattern and noted it, and been closed without finding, and about the line that read, "Results inconclusive," which he now suspected meant something other than that the results were actually inconclusive. The protocol developers did not have access to long-term deployment outcome data at the time of calibration, Polith said. That data was not centralized until the 3rd decade of the integration program. So, they designed an assessment that measured willingness to die for an objective, Mara said, without knowing that every candidate who demonstrated that willingness then went into the field and demonstrated it permanently. She did not say it as an accusation. She said it the way a person states the contents of a room that everyone has been standing in and no one has named yet. It sat in the chamber like a physical thing, and Thrix-Kell looked at it from behind his data pad and felt the particular sensation of a being who has been inside a framework so long that he had stopped being able to see the framework from the outside, and has now, abruptly, been handed the view from outside. "What the protocol actually selects for," he said, hearing himself articulate it as if, for the first time, giving it the weight the data had spent 6 cycles quietly accumulating, "is candidates who will not look for a solution outside the parameters. It validates willingness to operate within the designed geometry until the geometry runs out." Mara looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not much, a fractional reduction in the focused stillness, something that in a human might be the quiet of a person who has been waiting a long time to hear a true thing said aloud in a room with enough authority to matter. "Yes," she said, "that's what it selects for. The ones who pass are the ones who stay inside the problem and spend everything they have on it. And then they go into real engagements where no one designed the parameters and no one built you an exit, and they apply the same logic they were assessed on, and they spend everything, one time, for the last time." She paused. The room let her. "The ones who fail the rubric are the ones who look for the exit that wasn't designed in, even when they have to find it themselves, even when the corridor isn't on the tactical map, and they have to read the architecture and decide the corridor is a tactical element whether the map says so or not. Senior Assessor Peleth made a sound that his translator did not render, because it was not speech. It was the involuntary low harmonic that Raxian physiology produced under the specific cognitive condition of a fundamental assumption being revised without warning. A sound Thrixkel had heard perhaps 4 times in his career, and which, each time, had preceded a significant change in institutional policy. The chamber's acoustics caught it and held it for a moment before it faded. Colonel Hargrove stood up from the observer's chair. She crossed to the center of the room without waiting for the board to address her, which was a procedural irregularity, and Thrixkel found he had no interest in citing it. "Board assessors," Hargrove said, "the Human Systems Alliance has been tracking the Korth deployment pattern for 9 standard months. We did not raise it formally because we required a clean evidentiary record that established the pattern without ambiguity. Lieutenant Voss's run and the subsequent rubric flag provides that record. She let this land. She was very good at letting things land, which was, Thrixkel suspected, a skill cultivated over years of working within institutional frameworks that were not designed with human intuition in mind. The protocol, as currently designed, functions as an effective filter. It removes from combat integration the soldiers most likely to find solutions outside the problem's geometry. In the field, outside the problem's geometry is where solutions exist when all the inside options have run out. We would like the board to consider carefully what it has been selecting for and what it has been selecting against." Vren's carapace had settled into a steady muted register that Thrixkel associated with chastened arrival at an unwelcome conclusion. He turned to Peleth. Peleth's secondary appendages were folded in the configuration they adopted when constructing a formal institutional position rather than reacting to one, and Thrixkel waited. "The board," Peleth said slowly, "would need to review the complete deployment data set before any formal protocol revision could be certified. This is a matter of due process, not resistance. The implications require documentation that can withstand senior review." "Of course," Hargrove said. "We'll provide the full data set. We've had it prepared for 9 months." There was something in the precision of that. 9 months. The data set prepared, sitting in a file somewhere, waiting for an occasion that could carry it into a room with sufficient institutional weight. Thrixkel thought about the 3 inquiries that had each opened and closed, and about the difference between a data set that existed and a data set in a room where it could matter. He thought about the particular patience of beings who have the evidence and are waiting for the correct moment, and he thought that this patience was itself a kind of answer to the question of what humans were like. "Lieutenant Voss," he said, "is there anything you wish to add before the board deliberates on the outcome of your assessment?" She considered it. "Not on the assessment," she said, "but for the record. The Raxian candidate failed 14 months ago for the same deviation. She found the corridor approach at minute 9, 2 minutes faster than I did." She paused, and in the pause, something very dry and very quiet moved through her expression that was not quite a smile and was not quite the absence of one. She'd be worth reconsidering. Then she stood. That same effortless upward motion, no wasted movement, center of gravity doing the work so that the rest looked like nothing at all. She looked at the board panel and then at the observer's chair where Hargrove stood. "Colonel," she said. "Assessor Thrixkel." She crossed to the door and the door opened, and the corridor light came in around her for a moment, and she walked into it without looking back. The door sealed. The 3 of them sat in the chamber with the particular silence of beings who have had their foundational framework adjusted from underneath and are discovering the new shape of the floor. Vren was the first to speak. He said carefully that the data was unambiguous. Pelith said that unambiguous data had a way of clarifying questions that institutional inertia had previously made comfortable to leave unasked. Thrixkel said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about the subcomment in the rubric notation. Deviation resulted in non-standard resolution. He had read it as a procedural flag. It was, in fact, a record of someone correctly identifying what had happened and then having no framework that could accommodate the identification, and so filing it as a problem to be someone else's concern. Thrixkel looked at his datapad. The comparative record was still open. He thought about 6 cycles of administering assessments that he had trusted were correctly calibrated because they were 40 years old and had been certified through 3 review cycles, and no one had centralized the field outcome data until the pattern was already complete. 68 candidates, 68 deaths within 6 months, and 3 quiet institutional inquiries that had each found the pattern and each found a reason to close, without a finding, because the finding was too large and too uncomfortable, and the evidence was not yet clean enough to require action from someone with the authority to act. He drafted the formal reversal of outcome for Maravas's assessment record that afternoon. He drafted the recommendation for a comprehensive protocol review simultaneously, cross-referencing every Korath administration from the past 4 decades against the field deployment outcomes that the dataset would provide. He used precise language and a clear evidentiary trail and cited every piece of data by its index number and origin, because the review that would follow would need to be airtight, and he intended it to be. The Raxian candidate, whose name was Vraxiel Toth, and whose deviation had been flagged 19 months earlier and ruled a breach for reasons that did not survive scrutiny, was identified in the review draft as a priority case for reassessment. Thrixkel noted that she'd found the corridor approach 2 minutes faster than Maravas, and he noted this without editorial comment, simply as data, but he noted it. The formal revision was certified at the senior board level 6 weeks after he submitted the draft. The Korath protocol was suspended pending complete rewrite. All 3 previously failed deviation candidates were flagged for reassessment and reassignment review. The field outcome dataset was formally entered into the assessment records as a primary calibration document, which meant that every future protocol development would be required to account for downstream field survivability, rather than treating assessment performance as an endpoint. Thrixkel signed the certification documents in the same chamber where he had reviewed the file. The signature function on his datapad required a mandible pressure authentication, which he found, as he authenticated it, to be a faintly absurd moment for the weight it carried. Outside, the station's atmospheric processors cycled as they always had. He received the message 43 days after the certification. It came flagged from an Alliance transit relay at the outer edge of the Meridian sector, tagged routine, no header, no rank attribution. The sender notation said simply, Voss, M. It said, Terran Station, secondary corridor approach, found an exit. Brought everyone home. Thought you'd want to know. He read it twice. He read it a 3rd time, which was unusual for him, and considered what he was actually registering when he read it a 3rd time. It was not relief exactly. It was something more complicated than relief. The particular state of a being who has resolved an institutional problem to the best of his ability, and then received a piece of data that confirms the resolution was correct, while also confirming that the resolution is ongoing and will continue to be ongoing because the human was still out there, still finding corridors the map did not include, still walking her people through them, still bringing everyone home. He set the datapad down and looked at the view panel on the far wall of his office, which gave out onto the Meridian primary docking array. A dozen vessels moved in and out of berths, with the slow, coordinated patience of a functioning system. Each one carried crew trusting the framework they were inside to have gotten its calibrations right. He thought about what it would mean to be a species that was very good at finding the exit when the exits were not marked, and about what it would mean to operate in systems designed by species who had, for 40 years, been quietly filtering out everyone with that particular capability, and about the fact that the humans had kept the dataset for 9 months and waited for the moment that could carry it, rather than forcing it into a room that wasn't ready. They had the evidence the entire time. They had brought it when the room was ready. That, too, was a kind of exit finding, and it was the kind that left no bodies behind. He started the draft for a new assessment framework because the existing Korath protocol was suspended and something would need to replace it, and because he was the assessor who had processed the revision, and it was his professional obligation to contribute to what came next. He sat for a long moment before writing the first line. The question of how you assess someone's capacity to find an exit that isn't marked was a more interesting problem than any assessment question he had previously considered, because you could not build the exit into the scenario because then it would be marked, and a marked exit was not what you were assessing for. What you were assessing for was the capacity to look at a room with sealed parameters and ask whether the sealing was complete, and to keep asking that question quietly and methodically while everything else was demanding attention. He wrote down 3 provisional approaches and flagged each one for internal review. He wrote a note to himself at the bottom of the draft that said, "The candidate who finds the exit fastest is not necessarily the best candidate. The best candidate is the one who does not tell the enemy the exit exists until after everyone is through it." He looked at the note for a moment. He thought about a woman with dark hair and light-colored eyes sitting in an undersized chair across a table from him, telling him in plain declarative sentences that the objective had been secured, as if this were simply true and the rubric's disagreement were a matter of the rubric needing to catch up. He thought about 68 names in a field outcome record that a department he had never coordinated with had been maintaining for 6 cycles. He thought about Vraxiel Toth, who had found the corridor in 9 minutes and been filed away in a liaison function and was now being reassessed, and who might, in some future engagement, walk her people through an exit that the scenario designers had not intended to exist. He thought about the particular quality of productive unease that came from understanding that the universe contained beings who were very good at surviving things that had been designed to be unsurvivable, and that these beings were on your side, which was the best possible circumstance, and that it was still, somehow, a circumstance that did not resolve into simple comfort. The station's atmospheric processors ran their steady cycle. The docking array moved its vessels with indifferent efficiency. Somewhere in the outer sector, past the Meridian Relay in the Terran Station, and whatever came after Terran Station, a lieutenant with dark hair and flat affect, and a very precise sense of where the corridor was already on to the next one, and the one after that, and the one after that. He kept working. It seemed like the correct response, and the framework he was building, he thought, was going to have to be very different from the one he had inherited. It was going to have to be built by someone who already understood that the solution lived in the corridor the map had not bothered to draw,